Hi, I'm Madhav Raman. I'm a partner at Anagram Architects. We are a multidisciplinary design and architecture studio based out of New Delhi and Goa.
My name is Shruti. I am principal at Anagram Architects. I joined them 11 years ago.
Hi, I'm Vaibhav. I'm from Anagram Architects. I'm partner at Anagram Architects.
Well, I don't think we put in so much thought when we started right after college. It was much more to we were seeking that adventure of setting up our own work and working on buildings, because 5 years of architecture school is a lot of theory and not too much practice.
So I know these guys since college, and we were a still smaller firm in 2014. So coming into the practice, it was a bit, I would say, not chaotic, but a little less organized. So, I was 34 at that time. So as a woman in practice with 2 kids, I was also trying to find my feet, in the office and in the practice. So I think we've all, in that sense, grown up together. And since 2014, trying to explore and discover things, sometimes reinvent wheels also within the practice.
When Vaibhav and I started our practice, it was I would say, a fairly foolhardy decision. Immature to the extent that I think we indulged in this enjoyment we had of working together. So really the practice started from this idea that, we should just work with each other. So there's nothing really bigger than that. But it's lasted us now almost 25 years.
SHARDC was the first building actually we ever did. And interestingly so that we were very young at that point of time, and client put a lot of trust on us. He wanted an efficient building for his NGO. Simply, that was the only brief, because the plot was very small, a 5 meter by 10 meter plot. Now we are making toilets which are bigger than that, but at that point of time, the entire plot was 5 meters by 10 meters. And for us, it was very interesting, because it sort of, as in we were looking at it beyond just the building. And that's what we always do. We don't look at building within its footprint. We are looking at it in the context of where it belongs. So it belonged at the boundary of an urban development, planned urban development, and a rural village, or urban village, sorry, which is in Delhi. So and there's a lot of traffic, pedestrian traffic. So how do you make the building iconic? How do you make the building interesting in terms of, and using basic material like brick? This building is also very interestingly done with brick, that we did that, and that's the basic sort of material we knew as a student, because it was not very long ago we had passed out. So we worked with brick, but we was trying to do it very differently. But that was not just for the facade, that was also acting, because it was a west facade, it was acting as something where how the light comes in, how the light perforates through that jali. It also acted as something which prevented the south sun from entering. So it was our very small sort of step towards looking at it basically sustainably, but very basic sustainability, not with gadgets and everything, but just basic simple sustainability, just simple basic rules one has to follow, which has been taught, which everybody has been using from time immemorial, that west sun is bad, north light is good for this kind of a climate, So those are the basic things we did, but obviously the limelight was the jali or the brick facade which we created. And at that point of time, it was very, very unique, because there was no parametrics then, and computers were very new. And we worked with the masons, and we learned a lot with the masons. That was the first building, so we didn't even know. To the first building, instead of making simple bricks, we made the brick differently. And it was just a thought, but then with masons and stuff, we tried to work it out, and it was very hands-on. It was to go to site every day, build something, and it falls down, and then work with masons, they'll create something with us. And that's how we built with hand, actually, initially few iterations of it. And then eventually we understood how to build it. And finally the masons in the beginning were very, very dismissive of the idea. They said this wall cannot be done. But later, once they understood it and they were baking, they were most excited to build something which they had not built something like this before. So yeah, so that was SHARDC.
After having built our first building, we realized what it actually meant to build would be, and what it involved, and where the gaps were in our own education understanding. And so it's been a great journey after that. The Aga Khan Award is obviously top of the pile, but we've won other awards on sustainability. We've won the Brick Awards, which fills us with a lot of pride because brick is a very intrinsic material to India. We've won the Wholesome Award for sustainability, where involved rethinking a transport system for Delhi. It was actually, we didn't quite believe it. We didn't actually even realize how big a deal it was when it happened. We were very young. I think this was nearly 20 years back. And at that time, the nomination came in the form of a letter. So at one point in time, we thought maybe some of our friends were scamming us or pranking us. But yeah, it was a big kind of boost because we were doing these things base up, working out of India without having studied abroad, traveled abroad. So, you know, that and all the other international awards that we won have filled us with this sort of sense that what we are talking about in this country, designing for this country, is relevant to the world. And I think that's not just bluster. That we are 25% or close to 20% of the world's population. So if we make architecture work for Indians, we are essentially contributing to how architecture develops in the world. So people are looking at India for these kinds of things.
This Cleft House is something, it's a residence. It's residence in North Delhi. And I think the client has only one brief, had only one brief. The client wanted something which he had never seen before. And I think, and when we went to the site and when we saw the site, we realized that there are no views up front. And it's a north facade. So north facade in Delhi is basically you don't get sun. So winter sun you don't get. And I was looking at and it was on the main road, so it gets very dusty. So if you look at the entire road, you realize that lots of buildings are there. They are basically, they have default balconies because balconies are free of FAR. So people, whatever you get free, people want it. So they make balconies. And the balconies are only gathering dusts. And the windows are shut and the curtains are drawn. Balconies are never used because when you come onto the thing, you are on a street which is very busy. You nobody sit on. It doesn't have winter sun, so you don't want to sit in the balcony anyways. So we decided, why do we actually need it? Why do we go for default where balconies are given? So we decided not to have any balconies, not to have any windows because it didn't require. And there was no view. And that also created a very monolithic kind of structure. But the entire light came from inside, and it's also from traditional tropical climate. Courtyard is a very important typology, and every house was like that. Streets were always dusty in India, so there were not too many windows on the street. The house actually opened inside, and that's what we tried to create. And so, but in a contemporary, modern, absolutely not a traditional way. So the entire G+3 structure is completely clad with Indian stone. It's a white in color stone. And when it was getting built, people thought it was a mall or something. It's not so we don't believe in typologies. You know, we don't say that house is a typology which has to be designed like this. I think typology, how the space feels. So if the courtyard feels like a house, it's a house. If it feels like a mall, it's a mall. So we divided the house into 4 zones and we had bridges to come across, and it became a very interactive space. When somebody is crossing, they can talk to people, and it's a multi-generation family, so they can actually interact like in a traditional house through a courtyard or a corridor. So that's how the Cleft, and obviously it sort of really worked in the climate like Delhi. So because there is no direct sun, it's all reflected sun, and the atrium was also air cooled completely from a downdraft cooling. So it really worked very well, the entire thing. So yeah, that's Cleft.
It is not only, it is very important, it is what we really like to do. So even if it was something that could be delegated or outsourced, we wouldn't want to do it. We like to go to site, we want to, test things out ourselves. This is how we've always worked. So it is extremely important also because, the kind of education system that we come from, where we used to make models with our own hand, or test construction techniques with our own hand on site, that kind of culture has remained in our office. So even today, if we are trying out a new detail, it will be that the entire team will go to site, the mock-ups will be assessed, tested, by us ourselves, and we try and in remote areas when we are working, you try and use technology and cameras and Zoom links, but I think we still heavily rely on touching the material ourselves and, yeah, testing the detail personally ourselves.
Some of our houses that we've done, they seem to have a lot of impact for the families they live in them. There's Utre, there's Cleft. You see, in India, a home that people build for themselves comes at the end of a very long aspirational journey. It's not considered a real estate investment. So I think most of our private residences is where you can genuinely see an impact in the lives. We are looking at how homes are morphing now. As we build larger and larger apartment complexes, residential complexes, we are understanding the dynamic between living as an individual in a larger community, and also the understanding of how those are actually instruments of real estate investment. People are looking for dividends that are financial, not just aspirational. So these are the things that we are beginning to understand now.
I think it is very similar to any other kind of scaling in another company. What you need to remember is, what brought you there. So like you're saying, the core commitment to whatever values you follow in the practice will remain the same, but I think you need to put in many more systems in place so that it doesn't sort of dilute over time, and when more people come into the team, the ethos actually trickles down the entire chain. So I think having systems, robust systems, so that you can maintain the rigor in the practice, and I guess my personality lends itself to that kind of work. You have to get material that is locally available, as much as possible naturally occurring materials. It's very simple, and there are very few things that you have to follow to ensure that the building is sustainable as it can be. You have to follow climatology, you have to respect the sun, its angle, its distance, seasons, etc. And you don't have to do too much. So I think all of our buildings do follow very thorough guidelines as far as sustainability is concerned, because the approach is such, because the studio approaches projects in such a way that it is inevitable that the approach to construction follows these values.
Like with most architecture practices, our route into architecture is building for people privately, their homes, their offices, their thing. Takes a fair bit of time, and usually the route to get into that is through government projects, is when you start working on social projects. But there are two that are quite different from the norm that I feel particularly heartened by. One is that we were the principal architectural designers for Project Samman, which was a Bill and Melinda Gates funded project to build 120 community toilets across Bhubaneswar and Cuttack, so two different municipalities, and the designs had to be tendered through government tenders. So, the specs had to be as per the PWD standards. So there were lots of technical restrictions. But what was interesting was that the project was motivated by trying to see that if you can build better spaces as toilets, if toilets are spaces that are not obnoxious or taboo, does that encourage people to give up open defecation and start moving into using sanitary facilities, even though they are communal? And I think that's been like my deepest, that's been the project that I feel has had the deepest impact, because out of those 120, about 98 are up and operational, they are managed well, they are providing some level of dignity and sanitation to those local communities, and they're successful enough to be replicated in other cities like Rourkela in Odisha. So I think that's been our widest impact. We've also, 4 years back, we did the pavilion, the festival pavilion for the Kochi Biennale. This was under the curatorship of Anita Dubey, and in many ways the curatorial note spoke about making the festival for everyone. And we tried to think about this pavilion not as a black box or a performance space into which you needed to enter in order to be able to enjoy performance arts. So it was a half transparent, half opaque, half air conditioned, half non-air conditioned sort of a space made with steel and bamboo. And I think in Kochi Biennale you see the impact of how a cultural space can actually energize an entire society across the spectrum. So you have people flying in from abroad, but you also had local, auto drivers and stuff commenting on what they saw. So you get really this idea that architecture or spaces, very often people think of them as assets or as functional requirements, but a lot of us aspire to look at these objects and try and understand, the architecture can mean different things to different people. I think that is where the joy in architecture is. When you build something and someone who is a user group you've never talked to, public architecture is like that, they come back with this really different take and often critical, and that's great, but a really different take on what you've built. And that's really where the joy of architecture is.
Post-COVID, we started getting a lot of work in Goa because Goa has become this market where people are looking for second homes. It's a rental market. It's a very interesting market because once you're looking for something which is like a second home, you are also looking for an interesting design, which is where we come in. We are trying to bridge a gap between contemporary architecture and what Goa really means today to people within Goa and for the people outside Goa. I think we are trying to not copy what a Portuguese architecture was. We are trying to do something which is new, which is Indian, which belongs to the market, and it has to be market sensitive. It has to work as a context of the money, the real estate of the market, how you sell a product. So it's very important to understand architecture also as something which needs to be sold. And I think that is something which was very new to us because we come from a very academic sort of a background. And for us, it was a good experiment, and I think it was something very interesting, and we jumped into it with the new sort of experimental mindset, and I think we were quite successful. We are known now quite well in Goa, and as a result of that, we opened an office in Goa, and I think we are trying to also now understand it from up close, not from very far away like Delhi. So be in Goa, understand it much more better. How a building works in Goa, not just how it looks, but in terms of weather, in terms of climate, in terms of rain. What do you make? How do you make a resilient building for an apartment? Because Goa is always known for smaller buildings. But what we are trying to do is a larger residential complexes. Now, how does that work? The scale completely is very different from what traditionally is understood as Goan architecture. And I think that is where we are trying to experiment and push the boundaries and still try to be true to the Goan soil and not create something bizarre and out of the world.
But I think our studio is very concerned about what's going to happen because of climate change over the next 20 years, which is really where we see ourselves before we sort of retire. And I think it's a very, very dynamic space, and it requires not just this idea of sustainability, but now I think architecture has to move on to resilience. We can see how our cities are flooding, how we live in many cities, and this is across the world, in places that are very, very highly polluted, where we seem to have eradicated all other forms of life forms like flora, fauna. Cities are no longer lively places. I think these are all concerns that architecture can address successfully. I'll give you a good example. We are now working very closely with the Haryana government to develop, to look at crematoria. Crematoriums in our Indian cultures, I mean, finally, everyone at the end of the day must visit a crematorium in one way or the other. But these are abhorrent places. They're places that are completely neglected by city planners, by architects, by even engineers. They actually need to be a highly technologized space. Why? Because they consume a lot of wood, they create a lot of pollution, and they're a place that needs to be empathetic, that needs to provide solace. This combination is something that only architecture can look at, holistically. And I'm very happy to say that we are pretty soon going to inaugurate a crematorium in Gurgaon, which we hope will be an almost zero pollution crematorium, and that's a huge achievement. And even the wood consumption in that is reduced and so on and so forth. So that's the sort of thing that I'd like to talk about nowadays when people ask me about sustainability and the climate.
You've heard this many times before, but bad design is the actually expensive design, and this is something that you have to tell the client, that if you don't get a designer, then you're actually building something that's going to cost you much more in the longer run. So a good designer is not only doing a good job of that space, they are going to save money for you. And I'd heard this somewhere, that we're too poor to buy cheap. Somebody who cannot so-called afford good design cannot actually afford to do bad design. So that is something that you need to convey to the client. And I think there is a huge change in the consumer in the last 10 years, where I think more and more people understand the value of good design, which is not just limited to having something that you can take a picture in front of and put on Instagram. It goes way beyond. I think people really understand now. More and more people understand that good design makes lives better and saves money, and in some cases also is sustainable.
Going back to the point I made, like, of architecture having a lot of meaning for Indians, especially from an aspirational perspective. Most people build their houses regardless of what scale, however small the house is, whichever small town it may be built. But I think there aren't enough architects and there aren't enough designers in this country to service that demand. So a lot of times, I would say 85% of homes are actually not built with any architects involved. Even when they're large-scale, high-rise apartments and that sort of housing stock, sure, there is an architect involved. But the moment you move away from that and look at small plot houses, there is no architecture, especially in small towns. I think that's a interesting proposition to how do we sort of broad base basic or acceptable levels of architectural design to really small homes that people build for themselves. And I think there is now a lot of interesting ideas that are floating around that can address that. For example, the smaller the size of the house, the simpler the plan will be. I think that's a great domain for AI to be pulled into in order to be able to advise even the end user, because at the end of the day, small houses work best when the user is involved in designing it. Prescriptions of what your apartment layout should be that comes from a designer who's never going to live in that house will never achieve the same goal. So I think an AI tool that helps small homeowners figure out their plans, layout, because that's what makes them the most nervous, that they're worried they will create a dysfunctional space. So I think that's a great way to solve that problem. And that could also be matched with building components. Very often, the smaller the house, the lesser the external facade that is exposed. Mostly, you're looking at very, very small external facades to the building that have to perform really well, because there's a staircase, there's light, there's ventilation. And very often people feel, then how do I make my house look good? I think both in terms of quality of construction and in terms of being able to broad base some aesthetic, some material innovation. The other way to sort of segue onto this idea of AI and ML is to think of buildings as component based. So people can actually, so I have this dream that there will be a future soon where, like you have desktop publishing available at every street corner through your photostat guy, you will have a 3D printer, not very large, but they say the size of a small fridge, available fairly ubiquitously. And if that happens, it's possible to then buy a file online, go to your local 3D printer, print your building component and assemble it IKEA style yourself. So I think really, if you want to solve the housing problem, those are the kind of radical ideas one needs. Otherwise, top-down, developer-led, government-led, affordable housing is the way to go until that technology becomes a reality.
This year, we have done some retail because it gave us an opportunity in this particular project to interpret the personality of someone specific and create a design language for their retail store that sort of reflected their personal style, personal aesthetic. This is for the ARC store that we did in Bandra, Bombay and Saket, Delhi for Ranbir Kapoor. And it was really interesting because, we do that for houses, homes all the time, which is to talk to a client, understand their persona, understand what they like, and then then convert that into their design language for their house, but to do it in the format of retail, where you are reflecting a single person, but you have to also make it, you know, have an appeal for people around, because at the end of the day, retail will run when a customer comes and buys the product. So I think that made, I would love to do more retail that gives this sort of an opportunity to really question how design can, how one can design in a different way, which is not the same that you would do in a retail space, I think. And especially for this project, because, you know, we built one in Bombay and then in Delhi in very different kinds of spaces. One was in a mall and one was in a housing society. That was especially interesting for me, I think.
I think every architect, I can say, or for us also, I can say very, very strongly that we are still work in progress. We still are learning, and it's a continuous learning curve. We learn something, we unlearn something. That's a continuous things which are happening. So over period of time, you look at your work and you realize things could have been better. You never look at it as this is the greatest masterpiece I've done. We've not done anything like that till now. I can't put, no projects is like that. I think while you are in the process of that building and design and construction, it's always you're into it, I'm completely excited about, as every project. So no project is different. While it's happening, when it finishes, you move on to the next project, because you see there is a, for any large process, and if you're making films or whatever, it's a long-term process, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. There are a lot of compromises which you do, which every creative person realizes, and he realizes, okay, what best you can do in the next project. So every project is a learning for the next project, and nothing is the best, I feel. So the best work is always yet to come. I don't think there is any best work. In terms of, I think for budding architects, designers, I would say design is a practice. Architecture is a practice. One can only become better by practicing it. So more and more you practice, better you will become. That's the basic motto of architecture.
Budding architects need to train under, you know, master architects. There is no other way. This has always been like this. And of course, we're moving very fast these days, so everyone wants to get to the, you know, star level very quickly, but no one's an overnight star, and there is no shortcuts to being, you know, successful in the longer term. So the budding architects need to find somebody and request them to take them under their wing and become an apprentice with them and live life. I think, you know, to grow in architecture is also to grow in life. So live your life and try and learn something from a senior architect. And so bar you have heard them that you shouldn't give up, you should keep at it and not lose heart. Yeah.
The first principal thing of starting on your own is to create a set of people who you trust implicitly, who you can depend on, who are also possibly going through the same process, because it's a very difficult thing to start your own practice. Of course, when we started, there was no social media, there were no co-working spaces, so even setting up an office was a big struggle. That's become easier, but there's also you know, a lot more noise around design and aesthetics now. It wasn't such a thing. There were no social media influencers that were putting out aesthetics, putting out ideas. So we weren't really, we were in a very niche environment. I think that's the biggest challenge now, is that how do you become someone that people come to for work? I think that's, while it seems odd that now there's social media, but I think there's a lot more noise than there's quality on social media, so that becomes a little difficult to differentiate yourself. Finances, I think whether it's in school or in college or in design school, no one teaches anyone really any sort of financial literacy, how to manage your money, how to run operations, how to run a business. These are lessons often learnt very, very painfully when you start up. And I mean painfully meaning you will make losses, and which is why you need a good support system, a partner, a family, friends who can sort of allow you to recuperate at least emotionally from the kind of trauma that's ongoing. Having said that, it's not all bad news. The great thing is you're your own boss. You are free to have ideas that you feel require a lot more investment on your part in terms of thinking than can be paid, and you can cross-subsidize it doing other projects to earn the money you need to, while focusing on things that are really important to you. You can't do that if you're working for someone else. So, and then the third thing is, I think now people are learning architecture. The people who want to study architecture and become architects are coming from smaller and smaller towns. I think it's a great thing. I would seriously advise that anyone who comes to a big city to learn architecture should try and consider going back to their town and setting up a studio. I think the value you would bring to your community would be so immense. It would replace any other joy that you may get out of winning a competition, winning an award. Just people you know coming to you and saying what an awesome building or what an awesome space you created is a joy that's incomparable.